Hey food students, Mrs. Kalawik here. Hope y'all are doing well at home. We are going to start our unit on basic cooking and culinary and baking skills with learning about measuring. Measuring is one of the most important skills that you need to know, especially for the world of baking. It's important in cooking too. By cooking, I'm talking about making things on the stove, cooking dinner, cooking meats and vegetables and things like that. That has a little bit more give. You can kind of add a little bit, take a little bit away. But with baking, whenever we're talking about making things like muffins and cookies and breads, baking is truly a science. And that's why measuring is so important. We're going to talk about and review some basic measuring tools that you might have at your house and that we certainly have in our kitchens here that are essential for making your baked goods turn out perfect. And then we're also going to talk about how to execute those measuring skills. If you remember from our equipment unit, we talked about how we have things like a liquid measuring cup that's used for liquids. We have measuring cups that are used for measuring dry goods and chunking ingredients. With your measuring cups, a basic set is going to have a 1 cup measure, a 1/2 cup measure, a 1/3 cup measure, and a 1/4 cup measure. Depending on what set you have, you may have more than what you see here. My set at home has a 2/3 cup and a 3/4 cup. You can get to all of those measurements by adding and coming up with different amounts within your measuring cups. So for example, if you needed 3/4 cup, you could take a 1/2 cup measure and a 1/4 cup measure, because a 1/2 cup plus a 1/4 cup equals 3/4 cup. So if you don't have a 3/4 cup measure, you could go this route instead. If you needed 2/3 cup of something, you could do 2 1/3 cup amounts. I caution you against estimating with a 1 cup measure. If you needed 3/4 cup, don't estimate 3/4 cup inside of this 1 cup measure, because it doesn't really give you an accurate amount. You definitely want to use the amounts that you have, and we'll talk about how to do that in just a second. With your measuring spoons, a basic set is going to include a 1 tablespoon measure, a 1 teaspoon measure, a 1/2 teaspoon measure, and a 1/4 teaspoon measure. Teaspoons in most recipes are going to be denoted by a small t, whereas tablespoons are going to be denoted as a big T or tablespoon. Some recipes write out the whole word tablespoon, while others write out the shortened version, like a small t for a teaspoon. In regards to your cup measures, a cup may also be labeled as a small c. So in case you see that, that's what they're talking about there. With some liquids, they may measure things out in ounces, and within a liquid measuring cup, you will see cups on one side, and then you'll see ounces usually in the middle. So OZ is a common abbreviation for ounces that you may see. So if that's what a recipe calls for, that's what you want to use. Other things that are measured in certain amounts include eggs, which we'll be using in a baking recipe coming up. I like to get the large eggs because most baking recipes involve a large egg. A large egg, if you cracked it into a bowl and you measured it out, is also equivalent to 1/4 cup. And 1/4 cup is also equivalent to 4 tablespoons. So if you needed to half an egg, you could crack and beat up an egg and measure out 2 tablespoons, because 2 tablespoons is 1/2 of 4 tablespoons, which is also 1/2 of a 1/4 cup and is also 1/2 of an egg. So sorry to confuse you with all that business, but it's good information to know if you're having a recipe and you need to split an egg in half. Another item that you may see, let me grab it out of the refrigerator here, is butter. So butter usually comes in sticks. You may have a tub of margarine or a tub of butter that you might get somewhere, but typically people are going to buy butter in sticks. 1 stick is worth a 1/2 cup of butter, but the sticks are also measured out in tablespoon amounts. So if you notice, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tablespoons in 1 stick of butter, or 8 tablespoons in a 1/2 cup, which also means that 1 cup is equal to 16 tablespoons. So if you ever have to do some crazy math in the kitchen, just remember that you can break things down by tablespoons and cups and things like that. Also, on a stick of butter, it actually gives you a nice little guide, and it tells you that 4 tablespoons is equal to a 1/4 cup, that 5 1/3 tablespoons is equal to a 1/3 cup. So if you have a particular recipe that requires a certain cup amount of butter, you can look at the guide on your butter stick to know how much you should be using. So let's now talk about how do we actually go about measuring specific types of ingredients. And the ingredients that I'm going to be measuring today, we are going to be using in a muffin recipe that you can watch in an upcoming video. Let's start out with some of our dry ingredients. With flour. Flour is usually sold. Move some of this stuff out of the way here. Let me grab my 1 cup measure. Flour is usually sold in 5-pound sacks that you can get at the grocery store. I actually like to store my dry goods that I use a lot of in big containers like this. And with flour, you want to spoon in flour into your cup up until it's heaping. Okay, you don't want to pack it down. This is no good. When you pack it down, that actually puts more flour in your cup than you actually need, and it makes your baked goods drier and tougher. You don't want that. So especially when you're making things like muffins or soft cookies, you definitely want to spoon in that flour and have it heaping. And then you can come in with 2 different tools. You can come in with a flat edge spatula or an icing spreader, or you can come in with the back of a butter knife. This gives you a nice level way to level out your dry ingredients. You want to have, if you can see that there, you want to have exact amounts whenever you're doing especially baking recipes. So we're going to dump this in, and we're going to be using that 1 cup of flour in our muffin recipe. We're actually going to be adding to it in a little bit, but I'll set that aside and talk about some other ingredients upcoming as well. Let's chat a little bit about things like sugar. With sugar, and we're going to be using a 1/2 cup of sugar in our muffin recipe upcoming. With sugar, I also like to keep it in a separate container. It's easier to get it out of a container than it is for the bag. Same thing with sugar, you're going to spoon it in, and you can take the back of a butter knife or a spatula and just level that off. Sometimes you can go back and forth if you notice that there's like a little hole or something like that. You want it to be, or if you see like little lumps, you can go ahead and crunch up those lumps inside of your container. We're going to be using this 1/2 cup in our recipe in a different spot with our muffin recipe coming up. So that's our sugar. Now, brown sugar is a little bit different, okay? Brown sugar, which we're going to use in this streusel part of our muffin recipe upcoming, is going to be packed. So whereas I said with the flour is spooned in and not packed, brown sugar is actually the opposite. I just got a nice new bag of brown sugar. What I like to do, especially with brown sugar, is keep brown sugar in a sealed container. When you keep it in the bag like this, it tends to dry out. Brown sugar is different than white sugar because it has molasses added to it, which gives it that moisture. With the brown sugar, I like to keep it in a sealed container. It actually keeps it moist for substantially longer than if you just like curled up the bag or put that in a Ziploc bag. So with the brown sugar, we're going to be using some tablespoons, 2 tablespoons to be exact, with our brown sugar. So what you're going to do is you're going to dip your measuring spoon, if it was a measuring spoon, or you could dip your measuring cup into the brown sugar. You're going to take your fingers and pack that down, because brown sugar tends to kind of have like some airiness to it. You want to make sure that it's completely packed so you have exact amounts. I'm going to level that off with my icing spreader just to show you that you can do that with a different item here. And we're going to pop that into our bowl. Let me show you that again. Again, you're going to spoon in the brown sugar, press it down with your fingers or the heel of your palm there, and make sure you level that off and plop that in there. So that is how you're going to go about measuring out brown sugar. The same thing is very similar if you're going to use a cup measure. So if you needed 1 cup of brown sugar, you could do something similar to that. Now, sometimes we have things like cinnamon, okay? Let me check my recipe here. So I put the right amount in there. I need 1/4 of a teaspoon of cinnamon. Just wanted to double check. It's good to double check. With cinnamon, in a lot of spices, you're gonna have a cap on your spice container. You wanna go ahead and take that off. Do not try to shake it over the measuring spoon. That's a lot of waste that's going into the garbage can. Take the cap off and dip your spoon in. And one thing that I like to do is take my cap as my leveler. You can use a knife as well, but I think the cap is very convenient. And just pull your cap and let all of the extra go right into your container, just like that. So there's my perfect 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon that I'm gonna add to that container there. I am gonna be adding some things to this bowl for streusel for blueberry muffins in a couple minutes here, so I'll set that aside and use that in a few minutes. Another thing that you may be measuring that's gonna be measured in small amounts are things like, find my 1 teaspoon here, baking powder. Okay, baking powder is nice because it has a built-in level on the inside. Baking soda is very similar. It has like a little card almost that you can drag your measuring spoon up on the inside. So if you see here, you dip in, you can squash any lumps down that are on the inside. Put in your measuring spoon, and I actually need 3 teaspoons. I'm just gonna show you with this 1 teaspoon measure here. When you drag it across, it gives you a nice even amount that we're gonna use also in our muffins. So I'm gonna pop that into my flour bowl. Where did my flour? There we go. Flour is right there. I actually need 3 teaspoons of the baking powder, which I'm gonna go ahead and do now, but little fun fact to save you some time, if you didn't wanna measure out all individual teaspoons, 3 teaspoons is also equal to 1 tablespoon, but I already got that sturdy, so I don't like to cross-contaminate in my kitchen. If I've used something for brown sugar, I don't stick it into the baking powder, because now you're taking brown sugar and you're putting it into the baking powder. You really don't wanna do that. So I like to use clean things for each item that I'm measuring out. So I'm gonna go ahead and measure out 1 more, and that's gonna give me my 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon. If you wanted to save yourself time, you could go this route. So, all right, so that is my baking powder there. Let's next turn our attention to some liquid ingredients. So, with milk or oil or water, anything that you're measuring out that is in liquid form, excuse me, you wanna use the lines on a liquid measuring cup. Avoid the temptation to do less dishes and use a dry measuring cup, because sometimes you can get a humpy amount. It actually gives you more liquid than you need. Whereas whenever you're pouring out, say 1 cup of milk, you can get down to eye level and you can check to make sure that you are measuring out exactly 1 cup of milk, just like that. So we are again going to use this for our muffins, so I'll set that aside for whenever I'm ready for that part there. Now it's time to chat a little bit about chunky ingredients. So I hate to call it chunky, but I mean, really, it's more like solid ingredients like blueberries, chocolate chips, even things like cottage cheese, you can use in a dry measuring cup. When you get fruits or veggies at the store, as we've talked about so far, you wanna make sure that you give these a wash first. So I'm gonna very quickly rinse our blueberries underwater here. And the strainer little container gives it a nice way to drain it without using a strainer. I'm just gonna put these into, whoops, have one on the floor there. I just need 1 cup for my recipe. And when you're doing a solid ingredient or ingredients that are like little pieces like blueberries, you basically just want to get as close to the top as you can, okay? You don't want it overflowing. You don't want not enough. You want to be as close to the rim of that cup as you possibly can get, okay? So we'll set that aside for usage in our muffins here in a few minutes. The last thing that we're going to talk about are eggs. And as I mentioned, an egg, I like to use large eggs because they just bake better in recipes. A lot of recipes are built for large eggs. But if you had jumbo eggs or medium-sized eggs, you can actually measure it out in a liquid measuring cup so that you can make sure that you have an accurate amount. So if it called for 4 eggs, 4 large eggs, you know that that is 1 cup, because each egg is worth 1/4 of a cup. So you would need 4 eggs, but say you had jumbo eggs and you had even more than that. Jumbo eggs might get you to maybe a 1.5 cup. So if you were to beat up your eggs, I would just measure to the 1 cup amount that matches your baking recipe. So with eggs, what I like to do is crack them into a separate bowl. Okay, so for this particular recipe, I just need 1 egg. I like to crack it on the counter, crack it into your separate bowl. And what this does is this allows me to check, did any shells come off of my eggshell? And if there are shells, it's easier to actually take your eggshell and scoop up any of those little eggshells that are remaining. It's much easier to do it in a small bowl than it is to do in your batter bowl. Batter bowl, like it kind of gets lost under the batter and you're trying to like fish it out and stuff like that. It's really kind of annoying. So I like to crack it into a separate bowl. Also, if you happen to crack an egg that's all bloody on the inside, I've run into that one time. You crack it into the separate bowl and you can throw it away at that point rather than sticking it into your batter and ruining your entire batter. So I recommend that you crack it into a separate bowl. And as always, whenever you're done touching raw materials like eggs, meat, anything like that, you definitely want to wash your hands before you move on into the recipe. You don't want to spread any foodborne illness like salmonella poisoning to anything else in your kitchen or anything else that's going into the recipe that you're making. So that is some information that I have for you involving measuring. I'm gonna go wash my hands so I make sure that I'm safe in the kitchen, but tune in for an upcoming video on how to use the ingredients that I've showed you how to measure in a muffin recipe. See you later. Hand washing time.